Mrs. H was an independent woman who lived in her own home with minimal support until she was 88. She was partially sighted and a member of the deaf community. We asked her niece to tell us a bit more about her. Her words are spoken by an actor.
She was my aunt, but I called her my mum. She brought me up. She was feisty and forthright, but loved a good laugh. She was an excellent cook and very hospitable. She was an avid reader and loved books and crosswords. She was a wonderful gardener and had an amazing garden of vegetables, fruits and flowers. She was adventurous and widely travelled.
Mrs. H was admitted to the Elderly Care Assessment Unit at the Heart of England NHS Foundation Trust from an intermediate care centre, where she was being treated following a fall. At the time of her admission, Mrs. H was suffering from confusion and was increasingly unsteady on her feet. She was incontinent and had not been eating and drinking adequately.
My aunt was in hospital for quite some time. While she was there, I rang from New Zealand every week asking how she was. I was given platitude comments about her health. Nothing very major was ever relayed to me.
In fact, Mrs. H suffered a number of falls in hospital that her niece was not told about. On one occasion, she broke her collarbone.
When my aunt was eventually transferred by ambulance to a care home in the most undignified manner, the first I knew about her condition was a 3 a.m. phone call from the care home saying they could not accept my aunt in the state she was in. She had significant bruising and an open wound on her head which hadn't been attended to or dressed.
Mrs. H had arrived at the care home bruised, dishevelled and confused. She was soaked in urine and dressed in someone else's clothes, which were held up with paper clips. The following day, Mrs. H was admitted to a local hospital because of concerns about her mental state and physical condition.
When I saw photographs that had been taken of my aunt, I felt it was beyond explanation. She had black eyes and there were great lumps all over her body.
She felt strongly that her aunt had been treated with contempt and had suffered much distress and indignity.
I wanted to understand why these things had happened, and that's why I began to make these complaints.
Mrs. H's niece first complained to the Trust and then to the Healthcare Commission. She felt that she hadn't received a satisfactory response, so then brought her complaint to the Health Service Ombudsman.
I hoped the Ombudsman would find out how and why my aunt had such appalling injuries and how there was such mismanagement of her health, welfare, dignity and her self-esteem. I wanted the Ombudsman to ensure that the treatment my aunt received would never happen again to any other vulnerable and dependent elderly person, and I wanted the Ombudsman to bring these findings to the public's attention.
The Ombudsman investigated her complaint and found that Mrs. H's cultural and linguistic needs were not met. Her comfort and well-being were not maintained. There was also a failure to carry out appropriate assessments, and no personalised care plan was in place to meet her non-medical needs. On top of that, some of her belongings were lost. All of this caused unnecessary distress to Mrs. H and compromised her dignity and individuality. The Trust's failure to keep Mrs. H's niece informed of her aunt's falls and condition caused her distress too. At the Ombudsman's recommendation, the Trust apologised to Mrs. H's niece. They also paid her £1,500 compensation and reimbursed her £300 for the loss of her aunt's belongings. They also drew up plans to prevent the same things from happening again. Sadly, Mrs. H died in August 2010, shortly before the conclusion of the investigation.
The process is very protracted and it can be very exhausting, but we trust the NHS to look after us in hospital. Our life really is in their hands. They have to be held accountable for their actions. It's people's right to ensure that their relatives and friends in hospital are well treated and to speak out and ask questions of the hospital staff if they have concerns about the welfare of loved ones. I'm very grateful for the help the Ombudsman gave with the investigation. It was very thorough and very professional. My aunt never knew or understood that I was fighting for justice on her behalf, but I'm sure she would have approved.